The Bonaventure Cemetery in Savannah, Georgia, is shrouded in mystery. An eerie resting ground known not just for its beauty but for its haunting silence. Nestled by the winding Wilmington River, the cemetery's landscape stretches with towering oaks draped in tendrils of Spanish moss that seem to sway on their own, trailing like ghostly veils over rows of worn tombstones. There is an unsettling feeling as one steps inside, as though the air itself becomes denser, wrapping around each visitor like a damp fog. Beneath the veneer of serenity lies a disquieting energy that lingers just beyond sight, an inexplicable tension held within the very soil, as if the earth itself holds tightly to its secrets. At first, Bonaventure appears still and quiet, a peaceful place of remembrance. But those who dare to wander past the entrance, moving deeper between the grave markers and marble statues of angels frozen mid-prayer, quickly sense a shift. The silence in Bonaventure is different, unnatural and heavy. It's as though every sound, even the rustle of leaves or the creak of old tree branches, has been muffled by an unseen hand. The deeper one walks, the more intense this silence becomes, filling the air with an almost oppressive weight. There are no birds singing, no insects chirping, only a strange echoing void that feels wrong, as though the very life in the cemetery has been stilled by some unseen force. As dusk falls, the mood darkens further. The waning light casts shadows that twist and stretch along the pathway, pooling into inky darkness between the headstones. Some say that the shadows here seem to take on a life of their own, shifting unnaturally, almost as though they're moving in time with a slow, unseen breath. The air turns colder, and the silence grows even deeper, as though the night itself holds its breath. It's often in these moments that visitors catch glimpses of movement in their periphery, a figure or a flicker of a shadow darting just out of sight. Some have reported seeing faint outlines, barely distinguishable from the darkness, slipping silently from grave to grave. No faces are visible, only dark forms that appear for an instant, then vanish, leaving only the thick, unnatural quiet in their wake. Locals warn those who visit to tread carefully, reminding them that Bonaventure is a place where the living are tolerated, but not entirely welcome. Those who ignore this advice often find themselves haunted by an intense, inexplicable unease. The air seems to hum with a warning, a whisper that grows louder the deeper one ventures, as though the cemetery itself is telling them to leave. Strangers to the place might chalk it up to superstition, dismissing the stories as folklore meant to keep the curious away. But for those who have truly felt the weight of Bonaventure's silence, who have sensed the eyes watching from unseen corners, the experience is something far more than legend. In this cemetery, the spirits are real, and they walk with those who dare disturb their peace, leaving a chill that clings to the skin long after they've left. As night tightens its grip on Bonaventure Cemetery, the shapes and shadows seem to take on a new intensity, growing sharper, more distinct as darkness swells within the grounds. The faint outline of headstones and ancient markers becomes distorted in the dim light, blending into strange, unearthly forms. It's here, in this deeper part of the cemetery, that visitors have reported seeing the figure of a tall woman, an apparition wrapped in clothing from a forgotten time. She appears almost regal, her silhouette framed by the ivy and creeping vines that blanket the older graves. Her face remains obscured by a wide-brimmed hat that dips low, casting her features in shadow, adding to her haunting mystique. Unlike the fleeting shadows seen in passing, this woman seems more corporeal, her form steady and deliberate as she moves through the graveyard. Those who have encountered her speak of a chill that sinks into their bones, a numbing cold that prickles across the skin and spreads inward, as though the temperature itself has dropped at her approach. Some brave souls, compelled by morbid curiosity, have tried to follow her, only to find themselves led deeper into the cemetery, to a secluded cluster of graves hidden beneath a tangle of ancient oaks. This area, isolated and shrouded in darkness, carries a sense of desolation, a warning that prickles along the spine, urging them to leave. Yet, her silent presence draws them forward, her movements so smooth and unnatural they seem more like a haunting dance than any human step. Witnesses often describe feeling the weight of her gaze, even though her face is never fully visible. It's as if she's watching them from some distant plane, her hollow eyes boring into their very souls. The longer they linger, the more overwhelming this feeling becomes, a relentless dread that swells with every passing moment. When some manage to get close enough to truly see her, she simply turns away, gliding farther into the dense shadows, her form flickering and blurring at the edges, as though she's slipping between worlds. For those who find themselves standing alone in this part of the cemetery, an unexplainable sensation of being utterly trapped settles over them, as if Bonaventure itself is closing in, refusing to release its hold. Yet just as quickly as she appears, she vanishes, leaving nothing but silence in her wake. But this is no ordinary silence. It's a thick, unnatural stillness, the kind that makes each heartbeat sound deafening. Those who have been fortunate enough to break free from her gaze report feeling a heavy, lingering weight, as though a piece of the cemetery has latched onto them, refusing to let go. Her presence stays with them, clinging to their thoughts, filling their dreams with dark corners and empty, watching eyes. Bonaventure's silent woman remains a mystery, her spirit bound to this place, eternally wandering, ever watching, and waiting in the shadows for the next intruder to cross her path. One of the most chilling encounters reported at Bonaventure Cemetery came from a young man named Samuel Hayes, a college student who had grown up hearing the legends, but never gave them much credence. One autumn evening, he and a small group of friends decided to explore Bonaventure after dark, laughing off the stories of ghosts and apparitions. Armed with flashlights and bravado, they strolled through the cemetery, teasing one another and brushing off any creeping sense of unease. They wandered the grounds with little regard, disturbing the graves with their laughter as they ventured deeper into the older sections. But soon the atmosphere began to change, growing heavier, as if the very air had thickened around them. It was Samuel who noticed the first sign of something wrong. He turned to glance at a particularly large angel statue, its wings spread wide, only to feel a distinct prickle of unease when he saw someone, standing in the shadows beside it. At first he assumed it was a trick of the light, a product of his overactive imagination, but the figure remained steady, barely moving, as if waiting. He squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, and felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. The figure was tall and draped in something dark, something that blended seamlessly with the shadows. No features were visible, yet there was a palpable intensity emanating from its direction, an icy, unyielding gaze that seemed to pierce through the darkness. Samuel called to his friends, his voice barely a whisper, urging them to look. One by one, they fell silent as they too spotted the figure, its outline just barely discernible from the inky night around it. The laughter that had once filled the air now seemed vulgar, out of place, as if they had unwittingly disturbed something sacred. The figure moved, shifting slightly, and Samuel felt his blood turn to ice. It wasn't simply that there was a person there, lurking among the graves. It was the overwhelming sense that this was no living being. This was something else entirely, something ancient and deeply unsettling. The group stood frozen, unable to tear their eyes away as the figure began to drift forward. It moved soundlessly, as if gliding over the ground, its form becoming clearer, yet somehow remaining shrouded, cloaked in shadow. Samuel described the sensation as oppressive, like a dark weight pressing down on his chest, suffocating him. His friends seemed paralyzed, their expressions mirroring his own horror as they watched the figure inch closer. The closer it came, the colder the air grew, until they could see their own breath fogging in front of them, a cruel contrast to the warmth they had felt only moments earlier. Samuel felt the sudden, desperate urge to run, but his legs felt as though they'd been turned to stone, anchored to the spot by the sheer terror coursing through him. The silence was absolute, deafening in its completeness, swallowing any attempt at speech or movement. Only when one of his friends managed to break free, grasping Samuel's arm with a look of sheer panic, did the group finally snap out of their trance. They didn't speak, didn't look back. They simply ran, feeling the eyes of something unseen burning into their backs as they fled, desperate to escape the clutches of Bonaventure's haunting silence. Even after they escaped the cemetery that night, Samuel and his friends couldn't shake the chilling sense of dread that clung to them like a shadow. For weeks afterward, each of them reported experiencing strange, vivid dreams filled with images of shadowy figures weaving through tombstones, their silent forms drifting ominously between graves. In the dreams, they were alone, each trapped within Bonaventure's darkened paths, unable to call out or move, surrounded by an unnatural silence that seemed to echo within their minds. They would awaken in cold sweats, feeling that piercing gaze still upon them, as though the figure they'd seen had followed them out, leaving a part of itself embedded in their memories. Samuel's dreams became more disturbing over time. In them, he would stand frozen in Bonaventure, every detail of the cemetery unnervingly clear, down to the slick, dew-covered grass, the cold marble headstones, and the twisted branches that loomed overhead. He would sense the presence of something watching him, a feeling that grew stronger and more oppressive until he felt almost paralyzed with fear. And just as he was about to move or scream, he'd catch sight of the dark figure standing only feet away, the space between them thick with a silence that felt as if it might consume him whole. He would awaken gasping, unable to shake the feeling that a piece of the cemetery had lodged itself within him. Each friend eventually admitted to feeling marked by their experience at Bonaventure. They tried to laugh it off, tried to convince themselves it was all in their heads, but the lingering sense of something watching them, something waiting, remained. They felt it in moments of solitude, an eerie prickling at the back of the neck, or the cold brush of air that seemed to carry an unspoken warning. Samuel, particularly, began to notice an odd stillness whenever he found himself alone, as though the quietness was more than just silence, as if it had weight, a presence that settled around him like a veil. He wondered if he'd brought something back with him, an echo of Bonaventure's silence that now refused to let him go. The last time the friends gathered to discuss that night, each agreed they'd never return to Bonaventure Cemetery. They couldn't dismiss the experience, couldn't rationalize the things they had seen and felt. Samuel had the strongest feeling that whatever haunted Bonaventure had let them go reluctantly, and would not be so forgiving a second time. To this day, he remains convinced that Bonaventure is no ordinary resting place, that it holds onto its spirits with an iron grip, trapping them in a world where silence reigns, dark and suffocating. For him and his friends, the cemetery's silence would forever hold a new, menacing meaning, a reminder that some places, once entered, leave their mark on you, an imprint that follows you home, lurking just out of sight, waiting to remind you of the things left behind in the darkness. In the heart of Bonaventure Cemetery in Georgia, beneath the shadowed limbs of ancient oaks, stands a statue that captures the attention and the unease of anyone who walks by. It is the statue of little Gracie, a solemn figure of a young girl with a gaze that seems to pierce through time. Sculpted in marble with an almost supernatural realism, Gracie's likeness is both haunting and beautiful. Her features are delicate, frozen in a soft smile, and yet her expression carries a sorrow that feels more fitting for an adult than a child. This statue, created to honor the memory of Gracie Watson, has since become one of the cemetery's most infamous mysteries. Gracie passed away at the age of 6 in 1889, and over the years, her presence at Bonaventure has grown into something much more than a simple memorial. The statue of little Gracie stands slightly apart from the other graves, almost as if it were its own entity, separate yet commanding the surrounding space. Her dress is intricately carved, flowing down around her feet, and her curls spill over her shoulders in such detail that one could almost believe they would move in the breeze. But it's her eyes that draw people in, eyes so expressive and lifelike that many say they seem to follow you as you move around her. This lifelike quality has unsettled countless visitors, some of whom claim that they feel her watching them even as they turn away. It is said that anyone who looks directly into her eyes can feel a strange, creeping sensation, like an unseen presence reaching out, pulling at something deep inside. What makes the statue even more disturbing are the stories of supernatural occurrences linked to it. Locals and tourists alike speak of an impossible tear that appears to form on her cheek, a single droplet, as if she is crying, her sorrow unable to be contained within the marble. This tear, seen by multiple visitors over the years, has become part of her legend. Some who see it have tried to touch it, only to find their fingers dry, the stone cold and unyielding. Others swear they've seen her eyes glisten briefly, almost as if she is alive, looking out from beyond the veil. The tales surrounding little Gracie's statue have taken on a life of their own, transforming her resting place into a destination for those drawn to the eerie and unexplained. Some visitors say that if you stand quietly near Gracie's statue, you might hear the faintest sound of laughter, like a child playing somewhere out of sight. The sound is soft, distant, but unmistakably joyful and chilling. It appears only when the air is still, when the cemetery is hushed, and all other sounds have faded. Those who have heard it are left with a lingering sense of sadness and dread, as if the laughter isn't coming from joy, but from a memory that is trapped, echoing eternally within the confines of Bonaventure's silent paths. With each retelling, Gracie's story grows, turning her resting place into a site that straddles the boundary between grief and fear, innocence and something much darker. As twilight falls over Bonaventure Cemetery, shadows deepen, stretching long and ominous across the gravestones and statues. It's in these fading hours of daylight, when darkness begins to creep in, that the tales surrounding little Gracie start to feel more real. Many visitors describe an inexplicable shift in the atmosphere as dusk settles, as though an unseen energy begins to stir. The air grows heavier, each breath weighed down by a peculiar thickness, and a strange, suffocating stillness replaces the usual sounds of evening. Birds fall silent, insects cease their hum, and even the breeze seems to vanish, leaving only the soft rustle of leaves as if something, or someone, is moving just beyond sight. One story, told often by locals, is that of a man named Richard, who ventured to Bonaventure on a dare, skeptical of the ghost stories that surrounded the place. Arriving late one evening with only the dim beam of a flashlight, Richard laughed at the warnings of Gracie's gaze and strode confidently through the quiet cemetery. He made his way to the statue, expecting to find nothing more than a cold, lifeless carving. But as he drew closer, Richard felt an unexpected chill, a coldness that seemed to seep from the ground itself. When he reached the statue, he found himself caught off guard by her expression, so innocent, yet filled with an unspeakable sadness that seemed to pull him in. As Richard stared into Gracie's marble eyes, he began to feel an odd sensation, as though her sorrow was reaching out to him. Then he noticed something impossible, a single tear glistening on her cheek. It sparkled faintly in the dim light, hanging there, suspended. He reached out instinctively, fingertips brushing the surface of the stone, but when he touched her cheek, it was dry, cold. Confused and unnerved, Richard took a step back, a chill creeping up his spine. Just as he turned to leave, he heard a sound that rooted him to the spot, a faint, soft giggle, drifting through the silence. The sound was unmistakable, the laughter of a young girl. It seemed to come from all around him, echoing through the quiet cemetery. Richard felt his heartbeat quicken, his pulse pounding as the giggle grew louder, shifting from an innocent sound to something more eerie. A shiver crawled down his neck as he realized the laughter was following him, surrounding him. Desperately he turned, scanning the empty cemetery, but saw nothing. He fled then, heart racing, feeling Gracie's invisible presence lingering as he ran, her soft laughter trailing him all the way to the gates. Little Gracie's legend has turned her statue into more than a resting place. It has become a strange kind of shrine. Visitors arrive with small offerings, delicate flowers, colorful toys, or worn trinkets, each left in the hope of comforting the lonely spirit of the child lost so young. Locals say that such gestures are a way to show respect, a way of acknowledging the sorrow that seems to emanate from her statue. Those who approach Gracie with a genuine reverence often leave unscathed, but stories abound of those who visit with cynicism, or worse, with the intent to mock. These are the visitors who report strange happenings, events that linger in their minds and haunt their dreams long after they've left Bonaventure's shadowed paths. One such encounter involved a young woman named Emily, who visited the cemetery with a group of friends. They were excited, almost gleeful, eager to capture something spooky on camera to share online. As they approached Gracie's statue, Emily felt a strange urge to reach out and touch it, drawn by an inexplicable pull. The stone felt colder than she had anticipated, an unnatural chill that made her pull her hand back with a start. The sensation was fleeting but intense, leaving her fingers tingling with an icy residue. Trying to shake off the unsettling feeling, she turned her attention back to her friends, only to notice something peculiar in her peripheral vision. Just behind the statue, barely visible, a dark shape lingered, shadowy, indistinct, but undeniably there. Emily squinted, trying to focus, but each time she turned her head directly, the figure seemed to vanish, slipping out of sight like smoke. The atmosphere grew heavier, the air dense with an odd, pressing silence that seemed to muffle even their whispered voices. As her friends prepared their cameras, Emily felt a soft tap on her shoulder, gentle but unmistakable. Startled, she spun around, expecting to see one of her friends standing close by, but found herself staring into empty space. Her friends were a few steps away, their faces pale and uneasy, mirroring her own sense of dread. As they turned to leave, a sound filled the quiet, soft but unmistakable. It was a voice, a child's voice, quiet and pleading. "Don't leave me," it whispered, barely audible, yet somehow cutting through the stillness. The voice seemed to cling to the air around them, fragile yet filled with a desperate loneliness that sent a chill through Emily's entire body. She tried to ignore it, to convince herself it was just her imagination, but the words echoed in her mind, trailing her even as they left the cemetery. In the days that followed, Emily found herself haunted by dreams of Bonaventure. Dreams where Gracie's sorrowful eyes followed her, where the whispered words repeated endlessly in her ears, "Don't leave me alone." Gracie's statue remains a solemn fixture at Bonaventure Cemetery, a haunting yet tender reminder of a child's brief life. To many, it has become a beacon, both for those seeking comfort and for those who come drawn to the mystery and dread that her legend has stirred. Locals and visitors continue to bring their offerings, creating a small shrine at her feet in the hopes of bringing her some semblance of peace. Yet, the tales surrounding little Gracie remain persistent, as if her spirit cannot find rest, lingering somewhere between sorrow and a search for solace. Over time, more stories have emerged from those who dare to visit her statue with the wrong intentions. A handful of skeptics have laughed off the legends, only to experience something strange and inexplicable later on. Whispers in empty rooms, childlike giggles heard in the dead of night, or even faint footsteps trailing them long after they've left the cemetery. It is said that Gracie's spirit clings to those who disregard her sorrow, her silent plea for acknowledgement. Those who have left her statue with an attitude of indifference or mockery find themselves haunted, plagued by an eerie feeling that they are never truly alone. For Emily and others like her, the memory of their encounter with Gracie lingers, growing more vivid with each retelling. Emily, in particular, cannot escape the image of Gracie's face, nor the sensation of that cold, invisible hand on her shoulder. She still dreams of Bonaventure's quiet paths, where Gracie's statue waits, sorrowful and watchful, her marble eyes following each visitor who dares to approach. In these dreams, Emily finds herself trapped in the cemetery, rooted to the ground, unable to turn away from Gracie's gaze as that small, mournful voice echoes once more, "Don't leave me." For the townsfolk of Savannah, and the many visitors who come seeking the macabre thrill of the unknown, Gracie's resting place serves as both a site of homage and a warning. The statue remains still and silent, yet alive with an energy that cannot be denied, as if the child it represents is waiting, watching, and perhaps reaching out from the other side. Some say that if you listen closely, especially on a quiet, misty evening, you might hear her soft laughter, or even feel her small, ghostly hand slipping into yours. But all are cautioned to remember, when you visit Gracie, respect her sorrow and innocence, or risk carrying a piece of Bonaventure's haunting silence with you, a reminder of the spirits who do not rest so easily. In a remote corner of an ancient cemetery in Georgia, Hidden beneath the sprawling branches of centuries-old oaks and draped in veils of Spanish moss stands a statue shrouded in whispers and mysteries. This statue, carved with haunting realism, immortalizes a young girl named Alice McRae, whose life ended far too soon during a fever epidemic in the late 1800s. Devastated by grief, her family commissioned the statue to honor her memory, hoping it would keep her spirit close. Over the years, however, the statue has taken on an eerie reputation, becoming a focal point for chilling stories shared among the locals. They say that Alice's spirit remains tied to the marble effigy, as if bound by sorrow and loneliness too deep to release her from this world. Those who dare approach her grave often report feeling an overwhelming silence surrounding the area, a quiet so intense that it feels as if the air itself is holding its breath, watching and waiting. The statue, though beautifully crafted, possesses an unsettling quality that is impossible to ignore. Alice's face is delicate, childlike, with innocent features and a soft, almost fragile expression. But the look in her eyes is something else entirely, an expression of sorrow and longing far beyond her young years. It is a gaze that many visitors find themselves unable to hold for long, as if looking into those eyes reaches into something deeper, something dark and unresolved. Each detail is rendered with painstaking precision. Her curls cascade over her shoulders in delicate spirals, her dress flows around her small figure, and her hands rest in her lap, captured in a moment of calm. Yet, despite her serene pose, Alice's presence feels anything but peaceful. There's an awareness in those stone-carved eyes, a depth that goes beyond lifeless marble. Some visitors claim that her gaze follows them, tracking their movements as they circle the statue, watching, waiting, like a silent judge assessing each visitor's intentions. Over time, Alice's grave has become a kind of shrine for both locals and travelers who come to pay their respects or simply to satisfy their curiosity. They leave small tokens at her feet, flowers, stuffed animals, little trinkets, and toys, all placed carefully in the hopes of bringing comfort to a restless spirit. Locals believe these offerings are necessary to appease her, to show her the kindness she may have missed in life. They warn that Alice's spirit has no patience for those who come with mocking intentions. Legends tell of visitors who approach the statue with skepticism or scorn, leaving with experiences they can't explain, fleeting visions, chills, or feelings of dread that haunt them long after they've left the cemetery. One story, passed down through the years, tells of a man named Thomas, a skeptic who had come to Alice's grave determined to disprove the myths. He chuckled at the toys and trinkets scattered at the statue's feet, dismissing them as the work of the overly superstitious. Standing boldly before the statue, he leaned in close, staring directly into Alice's eyes, daring her spirit to make itself known. The silence around him felt almost unnatural, an eerie quiet that seemed to muffle even the rustling leaves and distant birdsong. Just as he was about to turn away, he felt an unexpected weight settle around him. The air grew heavy, dense, pressing in on him from every direction. It was as if the atmosphere itself had thickened, closing in on him. And then, the silence deepened even further, drowning out all sound, swallowing every last whisper of the outside world in an unnatural quiet so intense it felt like a physical force, surrounding him, holding him in place. As Thomas took his first steps away from the statue, a chilling sound broke the silence, a soft, high-pitched giggle, faint yet unmistakable. The sound hung in the air, weaving through the quiet, and his heart leapt as he froze in place. For a moment, he tried to tell himself it was just his mind playing tricks, but the laughter continued, lingering and faint, as if carried on an invisible breeze. It felt close, impossibly close, curling around him in a way that felt both childish and strangely sinister. The more he listened, the more the sound took on a mocking tone, as if whoever, or whatever, was laughing found great amusement in his discomfort. With growing unease, Thomas quickened his pace, glancing over his shoulder to reassure himself he was alone. But as he moved, the giggle followed him, drifting just out of sight, never growing louder, but never fading. Each step seemed to be accompanied by that sound, filling the spaces between his hurried breaths and quickening heartbeats. The shadows cast by the twisting branches and gravestones seemed darker, more substantial, as if they might shift and close in around him at any moment. He picked up his pace, a nervous sweat breaking out as he forced himself not to look back, unwilling to acknowledge the strange presence that seemed to follow him. Yet, the giggle persisted, slipping through the quiet and wrapping around him, trailing him like an invisible shadow. Then, as he neared the cemetery gate, Thomas felt an icy touch on his shoulder, a light but undeniably real pressure that sent a jolt of terror through him. The sensation was cold, almost unbearably so, like a small hand made of pure frost, and he felt it settle on his shoulder with an unnatural weight. His breath hitched, and he whipped around, expecting to see someone standing there. But the path behind him was empty, only the faint outlines of graves and shadows stretching across the ground. Yet the icy chill lingered on his shoulder, the spot still tingling from the strange contact, as if whatever had touched him had left a mark. The giggle had stopped, replaced by an all-encompassing silence that felt even more oppressive than before, pressing in on him as if the very air was watching, waiting. Heart racing, Thomas bolted for the exit, his footsteps echoing louder than they should have in the eerie stillness. Once he passed through the gates, he didn't stop, running far beyond the cemetery's bounds, desperate to escape whatever presence had followed him. That night, however, as he lay in bed, the strange events of the day continued to replay in his mind. He could almost convince himself that it had all been his imagination, a series of strange coincidences. But then, just as he was drifting off to sleep, he heard it again, the soft, unmistakable sound of a giggle drifting through his room, curling around him in the darkness. The sound was faint but unmistakable, a ghostly echo from the cemetery following him into his own home. Over the following days, Thomas found no peace. The giggle he had heard at the cemetery began to haunt him at odd moments, slipping into his ears as he moved about his home, echoing faintly through empty rooms. At first, he tried to ignore it, chalking it up to his imagination. But the sounds continued, creeping up on him when he least expected, and the disturbing sense of being watched never quite faded. Shadows seemed to flicker in his peripheral vision, small, quick movements that would vanish the instant he tried to focus on them. The sensation of being followed grew stronger, and he found himself glancing over his shoulder more often, only to see empty rooms or vacant hallways. Each night, as darkness fell, the giggle would return, growing louder, filling the quiet with a chilling, childlike mirth that made his skin crawl. Sleepless and desperate, Thomas started to feel like he was losing his grip. The once faint laughter became more persistent, louder, no longer content to linger just outside his perception. Now it seemed to come from the walls themselves, wrapping around him in his own home, echoing down the hallways and seeping through the silence like a taunt. Shadows darted at the edges of his vision more frequently, and every now and then, he would feel the same cold sensation on his shoulder or his back, a reminder of the icy hand that had touched him at the cemetery. No matter what he did, he couldn't shake the feeling that Alice's spirit had followed him, tethered to him in some way he couldn't understand, her restless presence clinging to him like a shadow. Driven by fear and exhaustion, Thomas finally returned to the cemetery, clutching a small bouquet of wildflowers he had picked along the way. He walked with a sense of purpose, each step feeling heavier, the fear he'd been carrying now mixed with a strange sense of guilt. As he approached Alice's statue, he felt the familiar quiet settle around him, that unnatural silence pressing in from all sides, as though the very air was holding its breath. Kneeling before the statue, he placed the flowers at her feet, his voice low and trembling as he whispered an apology, hoping his gesture would somehow appease her spirit. The air around him grew colder as he knelt there, a chill creeping over his skin, sinking into his bones. And then, just as he was about to rise, he felt it again, a gentle, feather-light brush against his cheek, like a whisper of air passing close, carrying with it the faintest, almost inaudible, "Thank you," soft as a breath, yet unmistakable. For a moment, Thomas remained kneeling, frozen by the strange experience. As he finally stood and backed away, the air seemed to grow warmer, the oppressive silence lifting. Though he left the cemetery feeling a measure of relief, the memory of Alice's touch, the faint sound of her voice, and the chilling laughter would stay with him. He had escaped the haunting, but he knew a part of him would never forget the day he'd angered something he didn't understand. And while the giggle never returned, he couldn't shake the feeling that her eyes were still on him, watching silently from the depths of the cemetery, a reminder of a spirit's quiet, unbreakable reach. Though the nightly disturbances ceased after Thomas's return to the cemetery, the experience left him forever changed. The memory of Alice's cold touch, her giggle lingering in his ears, and the faint whisper of her thank you haunted his thoughts long after. He tried to push the experience to the back of his mind, convincing himself it was all just his imagination or a trick of the wind. Yet, no matter how much he rationalized, he couldn't entirely shake the feeling of being watched, especially in dark, quiet spaces. It was as if Alice's spirit had left an imprint on him, something intangible that could not be brushed away. As weeks passed, Thomas found himself warning others who expressed interest in visiting Alice's statue. He told them of the offerings, the flowers and toys left to comfort her spirit, and urged them to approach with respect. Despite his attempts to move on, he knew that disrespecting her had marked him in some way. Whenever he recounted his encounter to others, he could see the chill in their eyes, a reflection of the fear that still lingered in his own mind. He spoke of Alice not as a ghost, but as something deeper, something caught between worlds. In his heart, he knew her presence still lingered at the cemetery, bound to the stone likeness that bore her sorrowful expression, waiting patiently for the next visitor. Over time, the story of Thomas's encounter became a cautionary tale, passed along to newcomers and locals alike. People spoke of Alice McRae as a gentle but restless spirit, one who could be kind or cruel depending on the heart of those who approached her. Many still left offerings, careful to treat her statue with reverence, wary of awakening her wrath. Some said that on quiet, mist-laden mornings you could still feel her presence, soft, watchful, perhaps even grateful for the respect shown by those who dared visit her final resting place. But for Thomas, the fear never fully left. Occasionally on the stillest nights, when silence stretched long and deep, he would feel a chill trace down his spine, a faint reminder of that cold hand that had once rested on his shoulder. In his dreams, Alice's statue still appeared, her solemn eyes following him, her whisper echoing faintly through the quiet. He had learned to live with it, but he would never forget. For though her laughter had faded from his life, he knew it was waiting, somewhere beyond the edge of sight, in the hidden reaches of the cemetery, ready to resurface for those who dared disrespect her memory. Alice McRae remained a quiet watcher of the graveyard, a lingering spirit bound by sorrow and silence, forever watching from the shadows, her presence a reminder that some souls never truly rest.